It's incredibly exciting if you're thinking about feeding birds for the first time, but it can be a little difficult to know where to start. So we're going to break it down into 10 easy categories so you can turn your backyard into a bird oasis. So we're going to move about the yard here and talk about these different categories. I've seen some people turn some small yard spaces into incredible havens for birds, especially during migration. They will come visit if you make a great habitat for them. So let's get started. So the first feeder design I want to talk about is this kind of just standard one where birds can perch and eat and you fill it with seed. This one is kind of cool because it actually has a squirrel-proof system, or for bigger birds too, where if it's too heavy it actually closes the seed here. So this is one of the ways you can kind of do squirrel proofing is by having these feeders with these little tricks that help keep squirrels or larger birds away. Another category is the platform feeders. So these are more open styles where birds can perch up and sit and feed. Different species like doves love to come on here, but you'll get house finches, cardinals. It's really open to kind of anything. A lot of space for birds to come and perch, and you can even get multiple species at one time. Here we have some tube feeders, and these are perfect for finches. They love to congregate on here. Sometimes they'll even go upside down if the seed falls below the perch level. They'll sit up here and then feed below. But these are normally loaded with finch species. In addition to the tube feeders, you can have hopper feeders. They're more like a box. They have a roof over the top. Similar to the platform, they offer a lot of space for a variety of species to come and feed at the same time. In addition to these, you can also have some specialized feeders, such as hummingbird feeders that you may consider putting up in the spring. We have a whole video about expert tips for attracting hummingbirds if you want to learn how to attract them and take care of your feeders that you set up. You can also put out suet feeders, which are great for attracting woodpeckers and other species that like that higher fat diet. And sometimes people will also put out fruit so that birds can come and feed on that. It's only going to attract particular species, and I feel like it's most often done in the spring or in more tropical areas. Some tips for placing your bird feeders is you want them about 5 to 10 feet off the ground, and you want them far away enough from windows where birds aren't going to get scared and go right into the window. On your windows, you may want to put some window decals to prevent birds from going in. Sometimes they'll think that's a place they can just fly, and they will actually just hit the window and sometimes die, sometimes just be stunned. So you want to treat your windows so that birds aren't going to fly into them. Keep your feeders far enough away. And then it also does help to have some brush nearby so birds have a place to stage before they go to the feeder and go off the feeder if they're being chased by something or they just get scared. So it's kind of this balance of keeping your feeders far enough away so they're not going to get ambushed, but also they're going to have a place to go and hide if they need to. Now let's talk about the different bird seed varieties that you can get. One fan favorite with local birds in the yard is going to be the black oil sunflower seeds. They're high in fat, they can give a lot of energy to the birds that eat them, and they attract a wide variety of a lot of the species people love, such as cardinals, woodpeckers, and chickadees. Additionally, you have Niger seed or thistle seed, which often goes in the finch feeders, and they love that. So if you have specific setups for finches, you'll want Niger or thistle. Safflower is another popular seed. Squirrels don't really like it as much, but other species such as cardinals will still eat it, so it's good to have a little bit in the mix. And then white millet is something that often goes in these, and they will attract species such as the sparrows and the juncos. Oftentimes they'll feed on the ground, but they will come up to the feeder as well. What you want to avoid is mixes with a lot of fillers in them. So specifically, you'll hear about something called Milo. This is a type of seed that not a lot of the fan favorite birds like, but some other species will still eat. So it kind of just gets tossed around and makes a mess on the ground. So my advice for this is try to find a local seed store where you can go in and find the best mix of different seeds. They'll have a lot of the knowledge about the local areas because it is different depending on where you live. So having some kind of local store to go to, get some knowledge from the community. I'll put a link in the description to some of my favorites if you want to order online for seeds and feeders and stuff, but I think having that local resource is great. You can help support your local bird community. For storing your seed, I would suggest keeping it outside in something like a metal garbage bin. You don't want a lot of moisture getting in, and you also don't want to attract any insects or anything inside your house. So I think keeping it outside is best, but you want to make sure that it stays dry. Also, I've heard of some instances where bird feed stores, their mixes will get old and the seeds will actually spoil. So some of this stuff can get bad over time if it sits out too long, so you want to make sure there's no mold or anything in it and that you're getting the freshest seeds as possible. We talked a little bit about some of the supplemental feeder types, but now we're gonna move on to the foods you would actually put in them. So this is a suet feeder. Woodpeckers love this, nuthatches will come eat from it, and some other species. But this is where you put the suet block in here. So you'd open it up, put your block in, and then set it up and you're good to go. Now this is a tail prop. So this is for larger birds so they can sit and their tail will actually sit on this and they can feed a little more comfortably. Not all of them have it, but it's a cool feature to add on your suet feeder. Also, there's peanut feeders like this one, and peanuts can be a good food to feed as well. So a lot of birds will come eat from this. The squirrels try to get on it also. But one cool thing is we actually have a family of flying squirrels that'll come and eat from the peanut feeder at night. So that's a cool species you might have in your yard that you might not even know because they're nocturnal. Some other feeders you might have is fruit and jelly for orioles. And there's some debate on whether it's healthy to feed jelly because some of it has that like high fructose corn syrup in it. So if you want to do more research on the debate, there's two sides to it, but that is something people do, so I feel like I should mention it. Then you have the hummingbird feeders where you're putting nectar in there. Most common in the spring or in the winter, depending on where you live. There's a winter hummingbird season in some of the Gulf Coast states. In the West, sometimes you have hummingbirds year-round. So kind of look at your location. Make sure to check out that hummingbird tips video I talked about earlier. Also, some people will put out mealworms, so dried or live, and that's a great food source for things like bluebirds. So that might not be as common, but some people have a lot of success putting that out. Wrens really like mealworms too. In addition to the standard feeders, we've had a wave of smart bird products come up as well. So you have the smart bird feeders, the smart bird houses, smart hummingbird feeders, and they actually have cameras on them so you can watch the live feed. And that adds a new element to feeding the animals in your yard. So if you want to learn more about those, I've done tons of reviews. I have a whole playlist so you can learn about those smart bird products. When you're feeding birds, I would highly suggest getting a bird bath or at least some place for them where they can get a drink. In the winter, this is going to want to freeze up, so you can add like a heated element to your bird bath, keep it open, or just, dump the ice out, put fresh water in it so they can come and get a drink. Some people have success adding bubblers or other moving water features that can attract more birds. And you want to think about the depth of it too. Sometimes if it's too deep, it can be a little harder for species to reach down and get the water, especially if it's dropping throughout the day. Sometimes people put like a rock or something in the middle so they can sit on that. So it depends how crazy you want to get with it, but I would also recommend changing the water pretty frequently just so that it's not getting too dirty. The way that you feed birds and what you put out might change through the seasons. In the fall and winter, you might want to add some more high-fat, high-protein foods to your selection because birds are storing up that energy for winter. So it's important for them to get all of that. And I think winter is the most important time to have that food out. Some people do decide to stop feeding, and the best time to do this is spring and summer because birds have access to a lot more different foods at this time. You definitely don't want to stop in the winter. If they're used to having that food source and then it's just gone, it can be really tough for them to find other places to go and get food. In the spring and summer, you might want to add some of those additional food sources, such as stuff for orioles or hummingbird feeders, depending on your location. So you can change what you put out throughout the seasons, and you will notice different birds coming to your feeders at different times of the year. I find them to be the most crowded normally in a snowfall, if you live in a cold climate, because a lot of those places to feed are then gone and they have to come to the feeder. So you'll see a lot of activity then, and you'll see different species throughout the year. One other thing to mention is some people don't feed suet in the summer because if it gets too hot, it can go bad. And for the hummingbird feeders and the bird bath water, depending on the season, you might want to change that more depending on how hot or cold it's getting. Now, as far as feeder maintenance goes, there's a recommendation to clean them every 1 to 2 weeks. And it's suggested to use soap and water in a 10% bleach solution. You obviously want to be careful using bleach, so make sure you take the necessary precautions. And then make sure everything completely dries because you don't want any moisture getting in there and leading to mold. If you live in a hot, humid environment, you might have to clean more often. Now, I say this is recommended because I personally don't know a ton of people that clean this often, but I do feel like you should know what's recommended for having the healthiest birds in your area. Sometimes finches in particular will get something called conjunctivitis, which is actually pink eye. And you'll see one of the eyes looking like it's in really rough shape. and that's the time when you're gonna wanna clean those feeders. You may wanna take them down for a little bit. Check out the guidelines for your area and what they would suggest doing, but that's something to look out for. You wanna look for other signs of birds being sick too, and then kind of figure out, do I wanna clean? Do I wanna take everything down for a little bit? So that's something important to consider. Also, with the avian flu going around, the guidelines might change a bit for what they're suggesting, so keep an eye on the news and what kind of the community is doing as well. You can join some of the Facebook bird feeding groups and see what other people are doing. But it's important to keep an eye on the health of your birds and make sure they're as healthy as possible. Now let's talk about keeping squirrels away. This is one of the top things people struggle with when they set up a bird feeder for the first time. My number one fix is putting up a squirrel baffle. I have a whole video on how to do this if you want to check it out, but it's basically something that you put under or over your feeder so that squirrels aren't able to get around it. And you also want to put your feeder far away from anything they could jump from. I've seen them make some crazy acrobatic feats to get onto feeders, but I think setting up a baffle is your best way to prevent them from getting on. They can still be in your yard. I love squirrels, I just don't want them on the feeder all the time, chewing on stuff, pushing seed around, then you have to refill it more than normal. So squirrel baffle is my number one thing. Check out that video about it. Now, something that might be even more important than putting out bird feeders is just creating a bird-friendly yard. So planting a lot of native plants that have food sources, such as sunflowers if they're native to your area, native trees and shrubs that have berries, that's wonderful for attracting birds, and it's just great to have in your yard too. Also putting things like brush piles in, natural habitats, not putting pesticides on your lawn, that natural stuff is perfect, and I would say even better than just having your bird feeders out. If you have the space and it's allowed in your city, you can also let some of your lawn grow wild and just have native cover available for different animals that might use it. It's amazing once you add some of that stuff back in, how much nature will return to your yard. It's tough for them to survive in the really manicured, really pesticide-heavy environments, so try to make it as nice as possible for those native species. You want to check what's local in your area. It's best not to put a lot of ornamental stuff that might have fruit, but it might not be native to the place you live. So make sure to check that out before you plant. Once you start putting up bird feeders and having a bird-friendly yard, it may take a little while for the animals to actually find the feeder. So I've put out a bird feeder in a fresh yard once, and I'd say it probably took 2, 3, 4 days for the birds to actually find it. But once they know it's there, they'll be much more regular visitors, although they will disappear from time to time, depending on the season. So if that happens, don't freak out, but it does take a little while for them to come visit, and they will fluctuate in abundance throughout the year. But while you're doing this, it's nice to observe the birds, check for those diseases we talked about, but also just to see what species are hanging around. So it's good to have a pair of binoculars or a camera. You can see what different species are showing up, and it's fun to keep a yard list. You can see how it changes throughout the year and keep track of new species. So I think that adds a lot to the hobby. You can also do things like Project Feeder Watch, where you keep a list of the species you see and you actually send it in, and it helps with citizen science projects. So that's a great thing to be a part of. And finally, we're just going to touch on a couple ethical considerations, such as you don't want to be feeding your birds things like bread all the time, and you want to keep your cats indoors. That's one of the main things that harms birds out in the world. You have the habitat destruction, so creating a bird-friendly yard with adding habitat is great, but then if you have a cat roaming, it's the perfect predator for killing these species. So keep your cats inside, it's safer for your cats too, and try to encourage your neighbors to as well. So there you go, there's your beginner's guide to bird feeding. I also did a backyard bird identification guide if you want to know more about the species that are probably coming to your yard. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. Make sure to never miss a video about birds and birding. Let me know your number one tip for backyard bird feeding in the comments below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Badgerland Birding.